Have you ever wondered how Joseph of Egypt died, and what really happened to his body after his death? The Bible mentions his end, but leaves key details shrouded in mystery. In this video we explore the biblical account, the historical context, and the questions almost no one asks about the fate of Joseph of Egypt and one of the most fascinating enigmas of the Old Testament. Who was Joseph of Egypt really, beyond the story almost everyone knows? Because reducing his life to the dreamer sold by his brothers is staying on the surface of one of the most complex and decisive figures in the entire Bible. Before talking about his death and the mystery of his body, it's essential to understand who Joseph was and why his figure is so important within the biblical narrative. Joseph was not a secondary character or a simple moral example. He was Jacob's favorite son, born to Rachel, the beloved wife. From a young age, his life was marked by signs of purpose and conflict. His prophetic dreams, in which he saw his family bowing down to him, not only provoked his brother's envy, but also foreshadowed a destiny that seemed impossible. That destiny, however, did not arrive in a glorious way, but through betrayal. Sold as a slave and taken to Egypt, Joseph went from privileged son to foreign prisoner. And here one of the most surprising traits of his character appears. Even in adversity, he prospered. In Potiphar's house, in prison, in obscurity, Joseph never stopped exercising leadership, wisdom, and self-control. Not because circumstances were favorable, but because his character was already formed. The turning point comes when he interprets Pharaoh's dreams. In a single night, Joseph goes from prisoner to governor of Egypt, becoming the second most powerful man in the empire. This rise was no accident. His ability to interpret dreams, manage resources, and make strategic decisions saved Egypt and many nations from famine. But more importantly, it saved his own family. Joseph did not only govern Egypt, he preserved the line of Israel. Thanks to his management, Jacob and his sons settled in Goshen, where the people grew and became strong. That is, Joseph was the bridge between the promises made to Abraham and the future birth of the nation of Israel. Without Joseph, the biblical story would have taken a completely different course. Unlike other biblical figures, Joseph is not remembered for great battles or spectacular miracles. His greatness lies in constant faithfulness, prolonged patience, and the ability to forgive. When he had his brothers at his mercy, he did not seek revenge. He understood that his suffering had a greater purpose. That spiritual maturity is key to understanding why his death and legacy are treated in such a particular way in the Bible. Joseph lived many years in power, honor, and stability. He was respected by Egyptians and Hebrews alike. He built a family, had children, and saw promises fulfilled that once seemed like impossible dreams. He did not die as an outcast or as a defeated man. He died as a patriarch conscious of his role in God's story. And here is something important. Although Joseph lived like an Egyptian in many respects, he never forgot his Hebrew identity. He never stopped seeing himself as part of the people of the promise. That duality, living in Egypt but thinking about Canaan, will shape everything related to his death and what happened to his body afterward. That's why, when we talk about how Joseph died and what happened to his body, we're not talking only about a biological ending. We're talking about the closing of a life full of meaning, long-term promises, and a faith that transcended generations. In the next section, we will enter the historical context of his final years and understand how Joseph lived at the end of his life, what was happening in Egypt, and why that context is key to understanding the mystery surrounding his death. Because with Joseph, nothing is accidental, not even his end. What were Joseph of Egypt's final years really like, and what was happening around him as his story drew to a close? To understand his death and the mystery surrounding his body, we first have to place ourselves in the exact context of his old age, because Joseph did not die in chaos or darkness, but in a very particular historical moment, full of apparent stability and silent promises. After the great famine and the reunion with his family, Joseph enters a completely different stage of his life. He is no longer the young slave or the forgotten prisoner. Nor is he only the brilliant strategist who saved Egypt from disaster. Now he is a man firmly established in power, respected by Pharaoh, feared by many, and admired by others. His word carries political, economic, and social weight. For decades, Joseph governs Egypt wisely, maintaining order, prosperity, and stability in the kingdom. Meanwhile, Jacob's family settles in the region of Goshen. There, far from Egypt's political center but under Joseph's protection, the Hebrews grow in number, strengthen, and prosper. This detail is key. In Joseph's lifetime, the Israelites are not slaves. They are privileged guests. They live in peace, with resources and with a distinct identity. Egypt, at that moment, is a place of refuge, not oppression. Joseph observes all of this with a unique perspective. He understands better than anyone the fragility of circumstances. He knows political favor is not eternal. He knows pharaohs change, generations pass, and human memory is short. Although Egypt seems stable, Joseph is aware that the future will not be the same for his people. And that awareness profoundly shapes his final years. Personally, Joseph lives a full life. He has children, grandchildren, and a position of honor. The Bible mentions that he lived 110 years, a symbolic age in Egyptian culture, associated with an ideal and blessed life. This is not a minor detail. The biblical text is saying, implicitly, that Joseph reached human fullness according to the standards of his time. He did not die prematurely or in disgrace. He died having seen the fruit of his faithfulness. But spiritually, Joseph never considered himself completely at home. Although Egypt was the place where he lived most of his adult life, his heart remained tied to the promise made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Joseph knew Egypt was not his people's final destination. It was a stage, a parenthesis in a much longer story. This contrast between present stability and future promise defines the context of his final years. Joseph lives at the height of human success, but with his gaze fixed beyond his own life. That inner tension explains why his last words and decisions carry such deep weight. Historically, Egypt in that period was an organized superpower, with a strong funerary culture, obsessed with death and the preservation of the body. Egyptians believed life continued after death, and that the body had to be carefully prepared for that other existence. Joseph, as governor, was fully integrated into that cultural worldview, even if he did not fully share it. This detail will be key later. Because Joseph dies in an environment where the body, the tomb, and memory were sacred matters. It was not common to treat death as a simple ending. Every funeral was an act of identity, belonging, and faith in the afterlife. And Joseph, aware of this, makes decisions that break with what would be expected. In his final years, Joseph does not cling to power. He does not seek to secure his political legacy in Egypt. He does not try to establish an Egyptian dynasty bearing his name. Instead, his attention turns to something much more subtle, the future of his people. Joseph understands his personal story is coming to an end, but Israel's story is only beginning. That is why, as his death approaches, Joseph speaks. And when he speaks, he does not do so as an Egyptian ruler, but as a Hebrew patriarch. His words are not centered on Egypt, but on Canaan. Not on his office, but on the promise. This contrast can only be understood in light of the context in which he lived, a life of success that did not disconnect him from his spiritual identity. Another important aspect of the context is the generational transition. Joseph belongs to the generation that knew Jacob, that heard the family promises directly. His descendants, on the other hand, will be born and raised in Egypt. For them, Egypt will be normal. Canaan will be only a distant story. Joseph is aware of that risk. He knows memory fades over time. That's why everything related to his death has a pedagogical character. Joseph doesn't only die, he leaves a lesson. His end is not just a biological event, it is a message. A reminder that Egypt is not the definitive home, no matter how comfortable it may seem. Moreover, the fact that the Bible devotes so few words to describing his physical death and so many to his final instructions is not accidental. The text does not want us to focus on how he stopped breathing, but on what he planted. And what he planted is a long-term hope. This historical and emotional context makes Joseph's death very different from that of other biblical figures. There is no drama, no tragedy, no punishment. There is awareness, faith, and vision. Joseph dies knowing he will not see the final fulfillment of the promise, but completely certain it will happen. And here is where the mystery begins to take shape. Because when someone dies with that clarity, their final decisions are often the most revealing. In the next section we will go directly into what the Bible says about how Joseph died, what details the text gives, and what details, surprisingly, it chooses to omit. Because sometimes, what is not said is just as important as what is said. What exactly does the Bible say about the death of Joseph of Egypt, and why is that account so brief and, at the same time, so intriguing? When you reach the end of the book of Genesis expecting a detailed description of the death of such an important figure, what you find is surprising. Few words, almost no physical detail, and a clear emphasis on something that goes far beyond the moment of dying. The key passage is found in Genesis 50. There we are told that Joseph lived 110 years, that he saw Ephraim's children to the third generation, and that the day of his death came. There is no description of suffering, no dramatic scene, no extensive mourning or detailed rituals in the biblical text. The narration is sober, direct, and almost silent. And that is not accidental. The Bible shows us that Joseph dies in peace, in fullness, and with awareness. He does not die young, he does not die violently, and he does not die in disgrace. He dies after a long, stable, and meaningful life. This already sets him apart from many other biblical figures whose deaths are surrounded by conflict, punishment, or tragedy. In Joseph's case, the text seems to want to communicate stability and closure. But the most important thing is not only that Joseph dies, but how he speaks before he dies. His last words do not revolve around Egypt, or his power, or his success. Joseph does not depart as a governor. He departs as a believer. He tells his brothers something fundamental. God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land to the land he promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This declaration is key. Joseph dies affirming a promise he knows he will not see fulfilled in his lifetime. That tells us a great deal about his faith. It is not a faith based on immediate results, but on long-term trust. Joseph does not need to see the end in order to believe in it. And that conviction defines his death more than any physical detail. The Bible also tells us that Joseph made the sons of Israel swear that, when God visited them, they would carry his bones with them. This detail appears just before his death is mentioned. In other words, the biblical text places this request at the center of the account, not as a side note, but as the most important element of the end of his life. Then we are told that Joseph died, that he was embalmed, and that his body was placed in a coffin in Egypt. That is essentially all the information we have. We are not told where he was buried at that time, no tomb is described, and no specific Hebrew ritual is mentioned. We only know that his body remained in Egypt, preserved. This point is fascinating because it combines two worlds. On the one hand, Joseph is treated according to Egyptian customs, which reflects his status and the respect he had in that culture. Embalming was an honor reserved for important people. On the other hand, his desire is not Egyptian. He does not want to remain there forever. His body is in Egypt, but his hope is in Canaan. By being so brief, the Bible forces us to pay attention to what is essential. It does not dwell on how Joseph died because that is not what defines his story. What defines his end is his gaze toward the future. Joseph dies as he lived, trusting that God is at work even when it cannot be seen. Another important detail is that the text does not present his death as the end of something, but as a transition. Genesis does not end with a definitive tomb, it ends with an unresolved promise. The book closes with a coffin in Egypt, not with a burial in the Promised Land. That leaves the story open, waiting for continuation. This literary ending is powerful. Joseph's death does not close Israel's story, it propels it forward. It leaves a narrative tension that will not be resolved until centuries later, during the Exodus. It is as if the Bible wants the reader not to stare at death, but at what will come afterward. Moreover, the fact that the Bible does not describe exaggerated mourning or prolonged ritual can be interpreted as a sign of hope. Joseph does not die as someone defeated by death, but as someone who faces it with purpose. His death is not a period, it is a comma. It is also worth noting that Joseph is one of the few biblical characters whose death is not associated with a major moral failure. His story ends clean, coherent, aligned with his life. That reinforces the idea that his legacy is not what he achieved in Egypt, but what he believed about the future. In short, the Bible tells us Joseph died old, in peace, with faith, and with a promise on his lips. It does not give us medical or emotional details because it does not want us to stay there. It wants us to ask why his body was not definitively buried and what it means that his bones remained waiting for something that had not yet happened. And that question leads us directly to the next section, where we will enter one of the most mysterious aspects of this whole story: Joseph's final request before he died and why that oath marked the people of Israel for generations. Because in that request lies one of the deepest keys to this biblical mystery. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss more content like this. That way you'll always be up to date with our upcoming videos. Now, let's continue. Why would a man who had everything in Egypt decide that his final wish would have nothing to do with his power, his family, or his political legacy? Joseph's final request before dying is one of the most revealing and, at the same time, most mysterious moments of his entire story. Because it is not an emotional request, nor a practical one, nor an immediate one. It is a long-term request, directed to people who had not even been born yet. Joseph gathers the sons of Israel and makes them swear something very specific, that when God visited them and brought them out of Egypt, they would carry his bones with them. He is not asking for a lavish funeral, or an honorable tomb in Egypt, or to be remembered as governor. He is asking for something far stranger, that his body not remain where he died. And that raises an inevitable question. Why was it so important to him? To understand it, we have to go beyond the literal. Joseph is not speaking only about bones. He is speaking about identity, promise, and future. He knows Egypt is not his people's final destination. He understood it from youth, from the dreams, from the family covenant. Although he lived for decades as part of the Egyptian system, he never considered himself truly Egyptian. His heart was always in the land God promised to his ancestors. When Joseph asks for his bones to be carried, he is making a powerful declaration: my story does not end here. Even if I die in Egypt, I do not belong to Egypt. This request is a form of silent resistance, a physical reminder that the stay in Egypt is temporary, even when it seems permanent. There is also a profound pedagogical element. Joseph knows generations will pass before that promise is fulfilled. He will not see the Exodus. His sons will not either. Perhaps not even his grandsons. But by leaving his body waiting, he is planting a constant memory. Every generation will know there is a coffin that does not belong to Egypt, a body waiting to be taken home. This detail is key, because memory is fragile. Over time, the Israelites could settle in, forget the promise, and accept Egypt as their definitive home. Joseph's bones become an uncomfortable but necessary reminder, something that doesn't quite fit, something that says without words, we still haven't arrived. Moreover, Joseph's request is loaded with faith. He doesn't say, if God visits you, but, God will surely visit you. There is no doubt in his words. Joseph speaks of the future as something certain, though distant. And that turns his request into a prophetic act. He is acting like someone who sees beyond his time. We must remember that in the ancient world, the place of burial was extremely important. Being buried far from the land of one's ancestors could be interpreted as a rupture of identity. Joseph, aware of this, refuses to accept a definitive burial in Egypt. He prefers to wait. Even in death, he prefers to be in transit. It is also significant that Joseph does not ask for his body to be taken immediately. He does not seek a special exception. He accepts dying and being embalmed according to Egyptian customs. He accepts remaining there for a time. But he sets a clear limit: not forever. His patience is as great as his faith. This request turns his body into a symbol. It is no longer just a preserved corpse. It is a stored promise, an object of hope, something that connects past and future. Every time someone remembered Joseph, they would remember not only his story, but also his conviction that God would fulfill what he had said. This request also links two key moments in the biblical story: the end of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus. Joseph's bones are the bridge between both books. When Israel leaves Egypt centuries later, Moses will take those bones with him, not out of tradition, but in obedience to an ancient promise. This shows us that Joseph's request was not forgotten. It was passed down from generation to generation. In the midst of slavery, suffering, and God's apparent silence, someone kept remembering that oath. And that is astonishing, because it means that even in the darkest moments, the promise remained alive. There is also a personal message in all of this. Joseph does not base his hope on what he achieved in life, but on what God will do after his death. His faith is not anchored in his success, but in divine faithfulness. That allows him to die in peace, without clinging to the present. Joseph's request shows that his vision was always collective, not individual. He is not thinking only about his rest, he is thinking about his people's destiny. His bones are not only his own, they belong to Israel's story. They become part of the journey. And here the deepest mystery appears. Joseph, even in death, keeps walking with his people. His bones cross the desert. They wait decades, centuries, until they reach the right place. His body participates in the fulfillment of the promise, even though he is no longer alive. That gives his death a unique meaning. It is not only the end of a righteous life, it is the beginning of a silent testimony that will last for generations. Joseph does not speak from the grave, but his body says something clear. God fulfills what he promises. In the next section, we will look in detail at what happened to Joseph's body after his death, how it was treated according to Egyptian customs, and why that process is so important for understanding the rest of the mystery. Because what happened to his body was not accidental, it was part of the plan. What really happened to Joseph's body after his death, and why is that detail, one many overlook, so important for understanding the whole mystery? The Bible mentions this point briefly, almost discreetly, but what it says is deeply significant. Joseph was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. That single sentence opens a fascinating window into the cultural, spiritual, and historical world surrounding his death. To begin with, embalming was not something common or automatic. In ancient Egypt, this process was reserved for people of high status, pharaohs, nobles, and key figures of the state. That Joseph was embalmed tells us, without a doubt, that he died as a figure of enormous prestige. Though he was Hebrew, he was treated as a great man of Egypt. His death did not go unnoticed. The Egyptian embalming process was long, complex, and deeply symbolic. It could last up to 70 days. During that time, the body was carefully prepared for life after death according to Egyptian beliefs. Organs were removed, resins, oils, and wrappings were used, all with the goal of preserving the body for eternity. For Egyptians, the body was essential for the soul's future existence. Here a fascinating tension emerges. Joseph, although he accepts this process, does not share the Egyptian worldview about life after death. He does not believe his soul depends on his embalmed body in order to exist. So why does he accept being embalmed? The answer seems to lie in the wisdom and balance that always characterized him. Joseph does not reject Egyptian culture in a confrontational way. He lives within it, respects it, but is not completely absorbed by it. He accepts embalming because it is part of the honor Egypt grants him, but he redefines its meaning. For Egyptians, embalming was a way of permanence. For Joseph, it is a way of waiting. It is not a body prepared to remain, but a body prepared to travel. The Bible does not say Joseph was buried immediately. It says he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. That detail is crucial, a sealed, preserved coffin, but not a definitive burial. It is as if his body is left on pause, suspended in time. It does not fully belong to Egyptian soil, but it has not yet arrived in the Promised Land. This in-between state perfectly reflects the situation of the people of Israel at that time. They too are in Egypt, protected, but not in their final destiny. Joseph's body becomes a physical symbol of that spiritual reality, a visible reminder that everything they are living is temporary. Moreover, the fact that his body was preserved allowed his request to be fulfilled centuries later. If Joseph had not been embalmed, transporting his remains after so much time would have been impossible. Embalming, from this perspective, is not merely a cultural detail, but a providential tool, something that allowed his faith to extend beyond his own generation. This adds a deep layer to the story. Joseph uses an Egyptian practice to fulfill a Hebrew promise. He takes something from the world where he lives and puts it at the service of God's plan. His body, preserved according to Egypt's customs, becomes a silent testimony to divine faithfulness. It is also important to note that the Bible does not describe prolonged mourning or major Hebrew ceremonies around his death. The emphasis is not on grief, but on hope. The text does not want the reader to get stuck on Joseph's death, but to look forward. The body is there, but not as an end, rather as a pending promise. As time passes, that coffin containing Joseph's bones becomes a constant presence. Entire generations are born and die in Egypt knowing there is a body that does not belong there. In the midst of the slavery that will come later, that coffin will be a silent but powerful reminder. Someone before believed God would bring them out of that place. Imagine the emotional impact of that. While the people suffer, labor under forced work, and cry out for deliverance, there is a tangible object that says, "This is not forever." Joseph believed in the exit. And his body is still waiting. This detail also connects directly with the book of Exodus. When the time comes to leave Egypt, Moses does not forget Joseph. The Bible explicitly says Moses took Joseph's bones with him. It was not an improvised symbolic gesture. It was the exact fulfillment of an oath made centuries earlier. That means Joseph's body was preserved for generations, through political changes, the rise of new pharaohs, and the beginning of oppression. His body was a silent witness to all that history. It did not speak or act, but it was there, waiting for the appointed moment. Joseph's body teaches something profound. Faith does not always see immediate results, but it leaves lasting traces. His embalmed body is not a meaningless relic, it is a declaration of trust. Joseph believed so strongly in God's promise that he even planned his death around something that would happen much later. In the next section, we will follow the journey of that body out of Egypt. We will see how, when, and under what circumstances Joseph's bones finally begin their journey toward the Promised Land. Because the mystery does not end with a coffin in Egypt, that is where the road truly begins. How is it possible that bones kept for centuries became an active part of one of the most important moments in the entire Bible? The journey of Joseph's body out of Egypt is not a simple historical detail. It is a scene charged with symbolism, faith, and narrative continuity. This is where the mystery turns into movement, and the promise begins, literally, to walk. The Bible mentions Joseph again in a striking way at the beginning of Exodus. Centuries have passed. Joseph is long gone, his generation has disappeared, and the people of Israel now live under slavery. Egypt is no longer refuge, it is oppression. Yet in the midst of that dark context appears a phrase that connects directly back to Genesis. Moses took Joseph's bones with him. It is not a poetic mention. It is a concrete, deliberate, and deeply significant action. Moses does not take the bones out of nostalgia or cultural tradition. He does it because there is an ancient oath, a promise that has survived time, silence, and suffering. This tells us something key. Joseph's faith did not die with him. It was transmitted. Someone remembered. Someone taught the next generation that those bones could not remain in Egypt. Imagine the scene. The people of Israel leave in haste, fleeing oppression, crossing a point of no return. They have no stability, no certainty, only a promise. And in the middle of that chaos, someone makes sure to carry a coffin. From a practical logic, it might seem unnecessary. From the logic of faith, it is essential. Joseph's bones accompany the people throughout the Exodus. They cross the desert. They are present on the hardest, most uncertain, longest path. While the people doubt, complain, fear, and stumble, those bones remain there. They do not speak, but they remind. They do not act, but they uphold a truth. God fulfills what he promises, even if it takes generations. This detail changes how we understand the Exodus. It is not only an escape, it is a return announced centuries earlier. Joseph did not leave Egypt alive, but he left. And that matters, because it proves the promise did not depend on a single life, but on God's faithfulness across time. There is also a powerful contrast. The people leave with urgency, fear, and doubts. Joseph leaves in silence, without haste, with certainty. His bones have no urgency because they already waited long enough. And that calm contrasts with human anxiety. It is as if his presence constantly reminds them that this road, however difficult, has a destination. During the wilderness years, Joseph's bones continue traveling. While an entire generation dies without entering the Promised Land, Joseph remains on the move. He doesn't enter yet either. He waits. Even after the Exodus, even after Moses, even after the crossing of the Jordan, Joseph's bones still do not rest. This shows something profound. The promise is not fulfilled all at once. It is fulfilled in stages. And Joseph participates in them all, though he is dead. His body becomes a continuous line linking Genesis, Exodus, and Joshua. Very few biblical figures have that narrative privilege. Finally, in the book of Joshua, we are told that Joseph's bones are buried at Shechem, in the plot of land Jacob had bought. This is the end of the journey. The body that died in Egypt finally reaches the Promised Land, not as governor, not as slave, not as prisoner, but as an heir. This moment is deeply symbolic. Joseph comes home, not to the house of his youth, but to the land of the promise. His body rests where his faith always was. And it does so after the people have entered and settled, almost as if Joseph wanted to make sure the promise was not just an ideal, but a reality. The fact that the Bible specifically mentions this burial tells us it is not a minor detail. It is the exact fulfillment of a word spoken centuries earlier. No promise was forgotten. No oath was ignored. Joseph's body reaches its destination because God carried the story to the end. This journey also teaches something about faith that transcends generations. Joseph believed in advance. Moses acted in remembrance. Joshua buried in fulfillment. 3 different generations, one same promise. And at the center of it all, bones that never stopped waiting. There is something deeply human and deeply spiritual in this story. Joseph did not need to see in order to believe. He planned his death around something he would not witness. And that faith was not in vain. His body became proof that God does not forget, even when he seems to take too long. Joseph's body's journey forces us to rethink how we understand time, waiting, and fulfillment. It reminds us there are promises that are not fulfilled within a single lifetime, but that does not make them any less real. On the contrary, it makes them greater. Why does the Bible take the time to tell us exactly where Joseph's bones were buried, and why is that place not just any random site? When Joseph's final rest is finally mentioned, the report seems simple, but it hides enormous historical and spiritual depth. After centuries of waiting, a long journey, and generations passing, Joseph's body arrives at the precise place where it should have been from the beginning. The biblical text says Joseph's bones were buried at Shechem, in the plot of land Jacob had bought. This information, which may seem like a mere geographic detail, is in fact the perfect closing of a circle that began long before Joseph was born. Shechem is not just a point on the map, it is a place loaded with memory, promises, and foundational decisions for the people of Israel. Shechem was one of the first places where Abraham built an altar when he entered the Promised Land. In other words, it is a starting point, a place where God reaffirmed his promise to give that land to his descendants. That Joseph ends there is not accidental. It is as if his personal story, marked by exile, waiting, and faithfulness, finds rest right where it all began. Moreover, Shechem lay in the territory that would later belong to Ephraim and Manasseh, Joseph's sons. This adds another layer of meaning. Joseph not only returns to the Promised Land, he returns to the inheritance of his own descendants. His body rests among his own, not as a foreigner, not as a visitor, but as an integral part of the people. This burial also creates a strong contrast with Egypt. Egypt was the land of power, visible greatness, monumental tombs. Shechem, by contrast, was not an imperial center. It offered no outward glory. But it offered something more important, belonging. Joseph did not choose an impressive tomb, he chose the right land. That says a lot about what he truly valued. There is another important detail. Joseph was not buried only as an individual, but as a symbol of a fulfilled promise. His burial happens after Israel has already been established in the land. It is as if his body waited for the promise to become a collective reality before resting. Joseph did not want to arrive early. He wanted to arrive when the people were where they were meant to be. This moment also carries deep emotional weight. Imagine a people who have known Joseph's story for generations, who carried his bones during the Exodus, who saw them as a constant reminder of hope. Finally, they can bury them. Finally, the journey ends, not only the journey of a body, but the journey of a promise. Shechem as the burial place also connects Joseph's story to the people's future. Shechem will become the stage for key moments later on, covenant renewals, important decisions. Joseph's body rests in a place where Israel's identity is reaffirmed again and again. It is not a forgotten place, it is a place of commitment. Furthermore, this burial ends a tension present for centuries. The coffin in Egypt was a symbol of waiting. The burial in Shechem is a symbol of fulfillment. There is no longer a pending promise in that respect. What Joseph believed happened. What he asked for was done. And that strengthens trust in everything else God had promised. It is also interesting that the Bible does not describe a grand ceremony around this burial. There are no long speeches or detailed emotional scenes. The focus is not on the emotion of the moment, but on the fact itself, Joseph was buried where he should be. And that is enough. Fulfillment speaks for itself. This discreet closure is consistent with Joseph's whole story. He was never someone who sought unnecessary spotlight. Even his death and burial maintain that sober, deep tone. His life was loud in events, but quiet in ego. And his end reflects exactly that. Joseph's burial also carries a message for future generations. Faithfulness does not always receive immediate reward, but it does receive fulfillment. It teaches that some decisions are made for a future we will not see, but they still matter. Joseph planned his death thinking about generations he would never meet, and those generations honored his faith. This moment invites us to reflect on what we leave behind, not only possessions or memories, but convictions. Joseph left a conviction so strong it survived centuries of slavery and desert wandering. His bones mattered not because of what they were, but because of what they represented. When Joseph's body finally rests in Shechem, it is not only the end of his personal story. It is the confirmation that God was guiding every stage, even those that seemed forgotten. From the pit where his brothers threw him, to the grave where he rests in the Promised Land, everything was part of one continuous thread. What does this whole story really tell us beyond the historical facts, and why does the Bible take such care to narrate what happened to Joseph's body? When you look at the complete arc, from his death in Egypt to his burial in the Promised Land, it becomes clear we are not dealing with a simple biographical detail. We are dealing with a profound theological lesson, built across centuries, using Joseph's body as a silent but powerful message. In the Bible, Joseph's body is not treated as an unimportant remnant. It is treated as a bearer of promise. From the moment of his death, Joseph makes it clear that his faith is not limited to his lifetime. He believes in a God who acts beyond one generation, beyond favorable political circumstances, and even beyond death. His final request is not emotional, it is theological. God will fulfill what he promised. This makes Joseph a unique figure. Unlike others, his faith is expressed not only in living actions, but in a prolonged waiting. Joseph trusts the promise so much that he is willing to die without seeing it fulfilled. And that redefines hope. It is not waiting for immediate results, it is living and dying aligned with a greater truth. Joseph's body functions as a symbol of transition. In Egypt, it represents that the people do not belong there. In the wilderness, it represents that the journey has meaning, even if it is long. In Canaan, it represents that the promise is real. The same body conveys different messages depending on the historical moment. And that is not accidental, it is intentional narrative design. Theologically, this story teaches that God works through long processes. Not everything is fulfilled in a single spectacular act. Some promises require entire generations to unfold. And that does not mean divine absence, it means depth. God's silence for centuries did not nullify the promise Joseph spoke of. On the contrary, it strengthened it. There is also a clear message about identity. Joseph lived as an outsider, died on foreign soil, but never stopped belonging to the people of the promise. His embalmed body in Egypt did not make him Egyptian. His burial at Shechem confirmed who he truly was. This teaches that identity is not defined by the place where one prospers, but by the promise to which one belongs. Another important theological aspect is memory. God does not forget, but he also teaches his people not to forget. The oath about Joseph's bones was transmitted orally for centuries. In the midst of slavery, someone kept telling that story. That means faith is not only lived, it is taught. And when it is taught well, it survives even the darkest periods. Joseph's body's journey also anticipates themes that appear later in the Bible. The idea that death does not have the last word, that the future can matter more than the present, and that God fulfills promises even when human time says otherwise. Joseph thus becomes a figure pointing beyond himself. This story also redefines success. Joseph had power, wealth, and prestige, but none of that defined his end. What defined his legacy was his faith in what would come afterward. He did not build his hope on his position, but on God's faithfulness. That allowed him to die in peace, without clinging to the present. From a spiritual perspective, Joseph's body teaches that even what seems inert can have purpose. His bones did not act, but they accompanied. They did not speak, but they reminded. They did not decide, but they testified. Sometimes the greatest impact comes not from what we do, but from what we leave prepared for others. This story also invites personal reflection. What are we placing our hope in, immediate achievements or convictions that outlive us? Joseph shows us there are decisions that make sense much later, after we are gone. And even so, they remain worthwhile. Ultimately, the mystery of how Joseph died and what happened to his body is not about death, but about continuity. It is not about an ending, but about fulfillment. The Bible does not tell us this story to satisfy historical curiosity, but to teach that God guides history even when it seems to stand still. Joseph's life ended in Egypt, but his story did not. His body left, waited, and arrived. And with it came the confirmation that no divine promise is left unfinished. That is the true message running through the entire account. And it is a message that still speaks today to anyone waiting for something they cannot yet see, but still believes in. What meaning does such an ancient story have today, and why does it still speak to us so powerfully centuries later? As we reach the end of this journey, it becomes clear that Joseph's story is not only about how he died or what happened to his body, but about how a life can continue to have impact long after it ends. Joseph is not remembered for the way he died, but for the way he believed to the very end. The conclusion of this story is not a spectacular event, it is a quiet lesson. Joseph died in peace, trusting a promise he would not see fulfilled in his lifetime. His body was preserved, carried, and finally buried in the right place, not because it mattered as an object, but because it represented a truth that needed to accompany the people for generations. Joseph understood something many forget. Faith is not always measured by what we see, but by what we are willing to wait for. His story shows that God works on long timelines. Not every answer comes quickly. Some promises travel across decades, centuries, even entire lives. And that does not mean abandonment, it means purpose. Joseph did not need to see the end to know God was at work. He lived with that certainty and died with the same conviction. We also learn that the place where someone prospers is not always the place where they belong. Joseph reached the top in Egypt, but he never confused success with destiny. He knew how to enjoy what he had without losing sight of what was promised. And that clarity allowed him to make decisions even about his death with a vision beyond his own life. The journey of his body is, at its core, the journey of hope. From a coffin in Egypt to a grave in Shechem, every stage reminds us that nothing was left to chance. Even when the people doubted, even when they suffered, even when it seemed the promise had gone cold, Joseph's bones remained there, reminding them that God was not finished. This story also invites us to think about our own legacy, not what we accumulate, but what we believe. Joseph left a promise so alive that it survived entire generations. His faith outlasted his life. In the end, the biblical mystery is not in how Joseph died, but in how his death became part of the plan. His story teaches that even the end can be a seed, that even when it seems everything stops, God keeps moving forward. And perhaps that is the most powerful lesson of all. Waiting is not wasting time, and trusting, even without seeing, is never in vain. Joseph's story reminds us that true faith does not always see immediate results, but it is never left unanswered. If this biblical journey helped you better understand the mystery of his death and the fate of his body, subscribe to keep exploring stories that hide deep meaning. Like the video if it added value, and leave a comment with your reflection or question. Your participation helps this community keep growing and uncover more biblical mysteries.